Well, we know 19 children and 2 teachers were shot and killed. The worst school shooting in the country since Sandy Hook right here in Connecticut a little under 10 years ago. This morning, the whole state of Texas, really the whole nation, still trying to come to terms with what happened after an 18-year-old opened fire at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas yesterday. We are continuing our coverage this morning, still trying to make sense of what happened. And there are a number of different angles in which we are trying to make sense of what happened. One of which that we haven't talked about yet, school security. To what degree could this have been prevented on a number of fronts? We want to discuss safety with a former Connecticut State Trooper who we've talked with before, Patrick Chagnon. He is a former trooper who now runs Blue Line Security and helps schools with security issues. It's good to see you again, of course, under bad circumstances. Again. Unfortunately, yes, this is usually when we tend to value your expertise the most. And we have talked to you before. We still don't know a lot about what happened and what the security at Robb Elementary School was like. But based on what we do know, what were your first impressions about what happened yesterday, Patrick?
Well, here we go again. It was probably my first thought. Sadness, thoughts and prayers to surviving families, obviously.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here is always the question. One of the things that, that I'll kind of advise a client right now, what you can do to be proactive, especially with summer coming up, is revisit your policy and procedures. Make sure you have an internal threat team within your school and act upon that. And there's a process that needs to go through. You need to go through to develop that. But
And before we get into that, I just want to make sure I'm painting with the broadest brushstroke here, because a lot of people, I think, they're very sad, they're very angry, but they're also feeling very helpless, like you said.
Sure.
That kind of comes part and parcel with here we go again. Your opinion is that these are entirely preventable.
I would say
or at least most of them.
Most of them are preventable.
Okay.
And again, it's too early to kind of nitpick what's going on. Monday quarterback, this particular incident.
Yep.
But if you go back, if you want to talk about Parkland, Florida, the issues there, and clearly there were tall tale signs, breadcrumbs left out by the shooter that people knew about, heard about, and decided to just remove him from the school, which is not necessarily the correct course of action. And
red flags is what you're talking about. Always in hindsight, red flags here, and that seems to be a point at which we come up against a wall that we can't really get past. What do you do? How do you sort of get a school, get a community more attuned to those red flags and willing to do something about them?
So it's interesting you bring that question up, because every time a tragedy occurs like this, there'll be a safety security commission put together in that jurisdiction. They'll write a big report. Yeah. And I read those reports.
You do.
And consistently, they all advocate about internal threat teams. I had the really nice opportunity to work with the Secret Service for many years in my career, trained with the Israeli National Police on critical infrastructure matters. And all of those experts, and I agree with them, all say you have to start with threats. And that is the biggest issue. That's what we run a gap in, is identifying threats within our communities or within our schools. When I say community, I mean the school community.
Right.
And that's why every one of these reports say have a robust internal threat team, because they work. We don't hear about tragic incidents in those schools when they have good functioning internal threat teams.
And also, sort of what you can infer from that is that I think when a lot of people talk about how to prevent school shootings, they're thinking too far down the timeline. They're thinking about how to stop somebody when they first come onto a campus with a gun, as if that's the first time they're going to try to work towards preventing the problem.
Yeah. So as we've talked about in the past, I've got 5 approaches to school security.
Yeah.
And the first question I'm going to ask a superintendent or a principal is, what's your deterrent strategy? Yep. How do I deter somebody from even wanting to pick my school as a target? If I created the climate and the culture that says to that individual, I'm going to get caught.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be successful. That's number one. We do the complete opposite. We go to response. Do I have an SRO at school? Do I have somebody that's armed that's going to be able to intercede and mitigate the effects of the shooter? So we've got the deterrence, we've got the detection, we need a delay, right? And then we have the response mitigation factors.
Now, you're going to be with us here in the 10 o'clock hour, so I want to save some of the more concrete tips, of course, not to give your business away, but save them for then. But you've mentioned the internal threat team a number of times right now. Who should be part of that team? How many people and what kind of fields of expertise should they encompass?
So, it's going to be dependent upon the size of your community, what resource you actually have in your community. But ideally, an internal threat team is obviously a school administrator, a trusted staff member from the school, a teacher, certainly the nurse, maybe even somebody from a custodial staff, because
Sure.
they're all over the school.
They know the building,
They
right.
know the building
Yep.
inside out, emptying trash,
Yeah.
So they got a lot of intel. Your SRO, if you have
School
one, or a
resource
school
officer.
security officer, if you have one. A trusted parent from the outside that can give you some good feedback.
Yeah.
And mental health professionals that you can network with. So that's really the ideal recipe or the components that you want involved in an internal threat team.
Yeah. So we want to talk more about that, want to talk more about those 5 steps. But if there's the one takeaway that I'm hoping you're getting from Mr. Chagnon here is that you can't be waiting right until the point where there could be a shooter on the campus. These more preventative versus reactive measures are where a lot of school systems need to go, in your opinion. So
Correct.
we're going to talk more about that. Thank you. Good to see you again, sir. Glad to have you here. And remember, we're going to continue to follow any updates on the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. You can get them when we're not on the air on the Fox 61 News app, which you can get by pointing your camera right at the QR code on your screen right there. It is free, and it will be with you 24/7.